Today we're out here in sunny Palm Springs taking a look at the all-new 2017 Acura NSX. Now in case you're wondering, NSX does stand for something. Acura says it stands for New Sports Experimental. You may be wondering why we're taking a look at the NSX, since they will only be building about 800 of these a year, and so not too many people will be able to get their hands on one. The real reason is that cars like the NSX and the BMW i8 are showcase vehicles. They're showing what the future of Acura will look like in terms of technology, in terms of assembling procedures, the technologies that are used to actually build the vehicle, as well as what's going on under the hood. It should be obvious from this angle that the NSX is a very wide vehicle, but it's also very low up front, and that really helps improve the aerodynamics, helps force the front end of the vehicle down when you're out on the track. Up front, we have the Acura dual-style LED headlamps, and we have an interpretation of the modern Acura front end. This slots somewhere between Acura's new direction, interestingly enough, on the recently announced 2017 MDX and the rest of the Acura lineup. We have incredibly large grille openings all across the front, because even though this is a hybrid supercar, it does need an awful lot of cooling in order to keep that engine cool on the track. Let's dive right under the small hood first, because it is key to understanding the NSX. Under here, you won't find an engine. That's because the engine is actually in the back of the vehicle, but you will find two 36 horsepower electric motors. 72 horsepower total can be sent right here to the front axle and 108 pound-feet of torque. What makes this system unique is it can actually control each of those motors independently. So the system can actually send 36 horsepower to one front wheel, and it can actually try and regenerative brake the other wheel. In the back, we find a unique 3.5-liter V6 engine. This is a 75-degree angle V6 instead of the typical 60 or 90. This engine alone produces 500 horsepower and 406 pound-feet of torque thanks to twin turbochargers and just over 15 psi of boost. This is a mid-engine design, meaning that the engine is actually in front of the rear axle, and you'll actually find the cargo area right back here between the engine and the rear bumper. The NSX is a hybrid supercar, but unlike some of the other hybrids out there that we've seen, this is not a through-the-road hybrid. So there actually is a 47 horsepower pancake motor mated directly to the engine. So it goes engine, 47 horsepower motor, then we get the dual clutch 9-speed automatic transmission, and then the wheels. When this motor and the two motors up front and the engine are all working together, total system horsepower comes in at 573 horsepower and 476 pound-feet of torque. It's good for 21 miles per gallon combined. In EV mode, which is used in somewhat of a limited fashion in the quiet mode of this drivetrain or when starting you from a stop, the electric motors are capable of delivering up to 110 horsepower combined. The side profile of the NSX is somewhat similar to the last generation NSX, but obviously this is a much more modern vehicle. So we had a lot more swoops. Everything seems a little bit larger, a little bit bulkier than the last generation. This is definitely wider than the last NSX. And you'll notice really how low the front of the vehicle is. If I walk over here, notice the front of the vehicle is really only coming up to just about my knee. To give you an idea of how big the NSX is, this is about 176 inches long, which means this is actually 5 inches shorter than an Acura ILX or a Honda Civic. The rear engine design of the NSX means that 58% of the rear is right back here on the front axle and 42% is up front. That gives us a very similar weight balance and actually very similar overall exterior size to the Porsche 911, although the look of the vehicle is quite different from that 911. Some of the interesting styling and aerodynamic touches we see on this vehicle are this sort of flying buttress quarter panel. It's actually part of this section of the vehicle right here. You can actually stick your hand all the way through there. That's actually to help improve aerodynamics. It allows air to flow across the side of the vehicle and help keep the back end pushed down at higher speeds. This may be about the same size as a Porsche 911, but it's actually about 200 pounds heavier because of the batteries and the hybrid system. In order to help control that power, we do have 305 with 20-inch wheels and tires in the back, and there are a variety of different tire options to choose from. There's some track-focused tires, and there are these very street-focused tires that this model is wearing at the moment. The styling of the NSX is not only aesthetic, but it's also functional. This is all about getting air in the vehicle and then getting air back out again. That's why we have these very large sort of egg crate openings at the bottom of the bumper. It's hard to see in the video, but we even actually have air outlets right up here, right above the tail lamp modules, which are full LEDs in this vehicle. We have optional backup parking sensors, which are available as part of an option package. Now you may be wondering why you would find these optional on a vehicle that costs over $150,000, and the reason is weight. Acura says these add about 15 pounds overall to the vehicle, so if you don't want the extra weight, you can get yours without it. At the bottom of the bumper, we have these small fins to help smooth out the airflow, and you'll notice we have 4 exhaust tips right here underneath the license plate. It doesn't use all 4 at the same time. It actually uses the outboard ones when it's in the quieter modes, and it uses the inner ones to help improve flow. It actually almost completely bypasses the the muffler. Weight savings is also the reason that you don't find power seats in the NSX as standard. Our model does have them with the optional 4-way adjustable lumbar support. Luxury features do add weight to vehicles, so the more ways your seat adjusts, the heavier your seat is. And that's why we don't find them in every performance car out there. Overall, I'm going to give these seats a 9 out of 10. I did find them very comfortable for my body shape. However, they're not as adjustable as you will find in something like a Porsche 911. The seat bottom cushion especially just moves forward and backward. It does not actually move up and down. One of the downsides to rear or mid-engine vehicle designs is cargo capacity, and that's certainly true for the NSX. You'll only find 4.4 cubic feet of storage space right here behind the engine. With this 24-inch roller bag, you can actually fit almost 2 of them in the car, however. They have made this sized appropriately where you can insert one, push it all the way over to the side, and then you could, in theory, insert a second one, and you can actually push it all the way over to this side as well. Now, they can't really be any thicker than this bag right here because a portion of the transmission does intrude in this cargo area. Taking a quick look at the interior, you can see that our model does have the optional Alcantara headliner. We actually have a little bit more headroom than you might suspect in a vehicle like this. It's all because of the way that ceiling is shaped in the vehicle. Now, at 6 feet tall, I did have troubles wearing a helmet in the car, but I think shorter people should be okay. The seat belts in the NSX are attached directly to the seat frame there. We don't have any provision for 5-point harnesses in this vehicle, and our model does have the standard leather and Alcantara seats. There are 3 different kinds of seats available in this vehicle. There's an all-leather version that's optional. There's also an upper-level seat that still has the Alcantara inserts, however, it uses a better quality leather. Between the driver and front passenger seat is where you'll find the subwoofer, and we also have a very small storage cubby right here. It opens up to reveal a single USB port, a small storage area there. You can actually route your cord through that little hole in the back into this small cubby right back here. You can fit something like an iPhone in that area. Acura has really stepped up their interior game with the NSX. You can notice that over here on the door panels, we do have a lot of stitched leather going on that we don't find in other Acura models, and that continues all the way down there to the bottom of the door. We also have Alcantara inserts. We use very similar door switches and handles to the other Acura models. Moving on over to the dashboard, you'll notice that stitched leather continues all the way across the dashboard. We have sort of this design style that reminds me a little bit of some of the Cadillac models with this single fin running right down the middle. In the center of the dash, we have a standard 7-inch touchscreen infotainment system, which is quite new for Acura. We have seen something very similar in other Honda models, but this is the first time we've seen it in an Acura model. This does offer Apple CarPlay and Android Auto support right here on the screen, so it also makes this the first Acura model to do so. Below that, we have dual-zone climate control, and in kind of an interesting twist, right here on the side, we have some additional air vents. That's because if we go to the climate control screen, you can actually choose this mid option, and it blows air out of these vents sort of at your legs. It helps keep you a little bit cooler in the summer. If you were hoping that Acura would return to a more traditional gear shift, then you may be a little bit disappointed. We find the same button arrangement that we see in the MDX and the other Acura models. We have heated seat buttons right over here on either side of this center console, and we have a dynamic mode selector right here. This allows us to choose between quiet, Sport, Sport Plus, and the track modes that affects basically all manners of the vehicle systems, from the suspension to the hybrid drivetrain. Taking a closer look at the shifter, we have park, and then we have a button right back here for reverse. So we actually click that back for reverse. We hit this button down for neutral, and then this button forward if you want drive. If you want to return to park, we just hit this P button right over here, where you can actually just turn off the car and it will automatically park itself. Behind the shifter, we have an electric parking brake and the brake hold button, which is standard. This whole center console is also leather wrapped like we saw on the doors, and that extends all the way down here to the carpet. So this entire section is all very soft and leather wrapped. Behind the shifter area is another small storage cubby. It does not have a lid, and you can fit an iPhone 6 inside, but not a 6 Plus. It's just not quite wide enough. This is what the Nsx Key looks like. Looks very much like the rest of the Acura lineup, except it has NSX right there across the bottom. You can fit your keys in there if you want. One thing you may be thinking is missing is a cup holder, and in fact we do have one. It's this detachable module right here. You can store it in the glove compartment, and it inserts into a slot right over here on the passenger side. This kind of reminds me of certain BMW or Mazda MX-5 models. Over on the driver's side, we see Acura's first LCD instrument cluster. Now, this is a combination physical and digital gauge. So the 2 dials we see, one on the left and one on the right, these are actually physical. So the fuel level and this engine temperature, those are real. Everything else is actually part of the LCD. You notice that we have this chrome ring sort of running right here around the tachometer. That's actually a physical ring that floats right in front of the LCD to give it a little bit more of a physical look. The display is adjustable via a knob on the steering wheel, and you can cycle through things like your trip computer, your elapsed time, range, fuel economy, that sort of thing. The display does change based on the mode that you're in. So right now we're in the quiet mode, so we get a slightly different look than sport. And if we change modes, it'll also show you what exactly is changing the vehicle: powertrain, the all-wheel drive system, suspension, steering, etc. Then we have Sport Plus, which gives us a slightly sportier display. It also gives us an oil temperature gauge right here on the upper left side, and a temperature gauge for the super handling all-wheel drive system, which is of course that electric motor up front. If we move to Sport Plus mode, the vehicle will also attempt to nearly fill the battery to capacity so that you always have that extra oomph. If we click the dial all the way over to the right and hold, that will engage the track mode, which reduces the stability control system. It doesn't disable it, although it can be completely defeated in this vehicle. The NSX uses a unique Acura steering wheel with a flat bottom and a flat top. It is in carbon fiber in our particular model. There may be some additional trim options at a later date. It's leather wrapped, and Acura is very proud of the fact that they didn't leave any open seams. So you can see they actually wrap the leather completely around and then actually stitch it together on the inside so that there's nothing to interfere with your hand. The steering wheel also curves around inwards towards the back to give you a better grip on the steering wheel instead of leaving you to have your hand sort of in a cookie holding shape. Now the airbag cover is not leather wrapped, which I think is a little bit of a disappointment, but overall the steering wheel is quite attractive. We have very familiar controls to the other Acura models over here on the left side of the steering wheel: voice command button, dedicated phone buttons, volume up, down, track, forward, backward. And then on the right side of the steering wheel, we find regular old cruise control buttons. Dynamic radar cruise control and lane keeping assistance systems are not available on the NSX because they would add weight. The first thing we should talk about are the drive modes in the NSX. There are 4 different ones. We have quiet, we have sport, sport plus, and track. The modes affect the way not only the drivetrain and the suspension and the steering behave, but also the way the hybrid all-wheel drive system behaves. You can think of quiet mode sort of like your average hybrid sedan out there. This will actually try and start off from a stoplight or a stop sign in EV mode for a short while, and then it will actually engage the engine. If you're coming into a stoplight that's red or a stop sign, something along those lines, and you're slowing down, the engine will turn off in advance to help save gas. The car also closes the exhaust valves in the back, making the engine quieter, and it closes the baffles in the air intake system right back here that helps reduce cabin noise inside. Because the NSX actually pipes real intake noise into the cabin via a diaphragm instead of little tubes right here behind my ear. The next mode is Sport mode, and you can sort of think of that as the standard mode for the NSX. In this mode, the hybrid system will still start-stop the engine when you stop at a stoplight to help save gasoline, but everything is going to be a little bit sharper, a little bit crisper. It's also going to attempt to charge the battery a little bit more and hold lower gears to give you a slightly sportier feel out on the road. Engaging Sport Plus takes things up to the next level. It firms up the suspension even further, holds those gears even longer, and then we have the track mode. In track mode, this system holds the gears for a ridiculously long amount of time, so you definitely don't want to use that one in the city, but if you're out here on roads like this, it can be an awful lot of fun. Now you should be warned that track mode does reduce the vehicle's stability control system, so you can get into trouble a little bit faster. No supercharger would be complete without blinding performance, and in our quick 0 to 60 tests out here in the desert at 90 degrees, this ran from 0 to 60 repeatedly with launch control at 3.4 seconds. That's very quick for this segment. Definitely puts that between the 911 4S and the 911 Turbo. Now I have seen 0 to 60 times that have been shorter than that, so keep in mind that we were driving a pre-production model. The model was in the desert at 90 degrees and had been doing back-to-back launch control starts, so that likely has caused that 0 to 60 time to increase a little bit. The takeaway, however, for me is that this hybrid system doesn't really suffer from 0 to 60 slowdowns like we see in your average hybrid system. Remember that this engine alone in the back is producing 500 horsepower, so it's really not depending on the hybrid system an awful lot to increase power. When you take a look at your average hybrid on the market, like an average mid-sized hybrid sedan, the EV system augments the gasoline engine far more in terms of a percentage than we see right here in the NSX. Instead, with the NSX, what they're really using the hybrid system for is the torque vectoring up front to give you additional steering basically in the vehicle. They call it yaw. Basically, they can either overdrive one wheel or they can actually drag one wheel to cause the front of the vehicle to actually turn. And that causes the NSX to feel very nimble out on the road. It really makes the front of the vehicle go exactly where you point it. But they also use the hybrid system to help augment power at low RPMs. Turbocharged engines, of course, don't produce that much power at those low RPMs. I'm talking about perhaps below about 1500 RPM or so, and that's where the electric motors come in. Because the electric motors are producing almost all of their torque from 0 to about 2000 RPM, and this engine starts producing all of its torque at 2000 RPM. So the two technologies mate very, very well together, giving you that maximum acceleration. It's very noticeable when you do use launch control, because the 72 horsepower electric motors up front are using all of their power to start the vehicle from zero. In dual clutch vehicles, since we don't have a torque converter, you do have to basically slip the clutch in order to get the vehicle moving. And in that sort of 1/10 of a second at the beginning of the acceleration run, that's where those electric motors up front really come into play. Keep in mind that in the back, the electric motor is actually tied to the engine, so it's actually between the transmission and the engine. That means it does have to go through those dual clutches as well. Interestingly enough, braking is also another area where the hybrid system benefits us. Unlike other vehicles that are rear-wheel drive, we have those electric motors up front. And remember that the front wheels in a car are doing the majority of the braking. So rear-wheel drive hybrids like you see in some of the BMW models can't really provide that much regenerative braking because you don't really want to drag the rear wheels in a vehicle in that manner. By putting the electric motors up front, Acura allows us to do much more regenerative braking than we see in your average luxury car hybrid. Again, not only can Acura brake the front wheels with those electric motors, they can actually choose to power one while braking the other, so it can actually regenerate power with one electric motor, use that same power to power the other side. That, coupled with the slight rear weight bias, causes us to feel very nimble out on the road, very much like a Porsche 911. When it comes to handling, it really depends on what tire package you get. I have seen a few people complain about the fact that the NSX starts out with a street-oriented tire. You can opt for a track-oriented tire as well. That actually makes sense for the average NSX buyer because this is trying to compete with something like a Porsche 911. The average 911 driver doesn't drive their car on a track every day. They commute to work with it, they go away on weekends with it, and that tire will give you much longer tire life than you would with a dedicated sport summer tire. Sport summer tire on a vehicle like this, you could experience tire tread wear life under 5,000 miles. Something like the base tire in the NSX should give you about 15,000 miles or so with daily driving in mind. You can still take it to the track if you want to, but it's not really its mission. That tire is really intended for street use. Also, perhaps an interesting thing to say about a supercar is that one of the assets of the NSX is its compliant ride. It does, of course, firm up if we put this vehicle into some of the more advanced modes like Sport Plus. You can definitely tell there's a difference. But when we're operating in quiet mode, if you're just driving the car to the office, it's definitely a livable kind of vehicle. And that's not something you can say about every sports car out there. In a similar vein, the NSX also has relatively low tire noise, which actually surprised me because 305 width tires in the back are quite wide and you're very close to them in a mid-engine sports car like this. We don't really get that much road or wind noise in the NSX. Fuel economy is, of course, a very tricky thing to talk about with any supercar, but the NSX does fairly well for itself. It's EPA rated for 21 miles per gallon on a short highway run of about 30 miles or so on level highway. We had no problem getting over 30 miles per gallon very easily. The hybrid system obviously pays dividends in city traffic as well, but the harder you drive the NSX, the more fuel you're going to use. So when having an awful lot of fun with this car, we were down there in the low teens. The biggest takeaway really with the NSX is how easy this is to live with for a supercar. Some supercars out there feel like they're secretly plotting against you while you're driving them. You know, the Dodge Viper feels like it's trying to kill you in sort of a messy, unplanned fashion. The 911 always feels like it's trying to kill you in sort of a diabolical fashion, like it's plotting behind your back, waiting for the perfect moment to stab you. And the NSX just doesn't feel like that. The NSX feels like it's with you all the way. Now, that is interesting actually, because this still has the same weight balance that we see in the 911. It really has to do with the way the super handling all-wheel drive system is done and the way all the electronic nannies are working together. I do have a feeling that if you turn off all the nannies, this will bite you just like a 911 will if you're not careful. And perhaps that's a little bit of the fun, because if you don't want to have your car attack you all the time, you have that option in the NSX. But if you take this out on the track and you turn off all the nannies, believe me, you will definitely be able to slam this into the wall around the first corner if you really try. When you take the NSX out on the track, it's important to remember that only 72 horsepower can ever go to the front axle. That's because we have those two 36 horsepower motors, one on each side. This is very similar thematically to what we see in the Acura RLX hybrid, which is their large sedan. And the same sort of thing is going on in the NSX as in that RLX hybrid. In the RLX hybrid, the majority of the power is going to the front axle, so the electric all-wheel drive system really can't make the RLX hybrid feel like a rear-wheel drive vehicle. The same thing is going on in the NSX in reverse. We have 500 horsepower going to the rear axle, plus the boost from that direct drive motor that's connected directly to the engine. And then we have that 72 horsepower up front. So this is never going to feel like a traditional mechanical connected all-wheel drive system where it could send 50% of the engine power to the front. The NSX is always going to have a fairly classic, strong rear power bias. Instead, what Acura does with the front axle is they help torque fill. So again, as I said earlier, when you're taking off from an immediate stop, the 72 horsepower up front helps get you going in that sort of 1/10 of a second before the engine can kick in because of that dual clutch transmission. Once you're up to speed, the front motors do add additional thrust, and that is how you get up to that over 570 horsepower. But you're not really using those motors for that additional thrust all the time. Instead, what Acura is doing with those motors up front is they're actually helping steer the vehicle. Now, Acura calls this yaw control, but it's basically steering, and it causes the front end of the NSX to track just about perfectly wherever you have the steering wheel positioned. That's not necessarily going on, especially in competitors' all-wheel drive vehicles where they don't have that same kind of control over the front axle. Torque vectoring on a front axle in an all-wheel drive vehicle that has a strong rear power bias is really fairly unusual. The NSX is the only vehicle that I can think of that does it in this manner. Some vehicles out there will attempt to use brakes to actually try and torque vector across an axle, but Acura doesn't need to because they have these motors that can actually drag one wheel basically and power the other wheel. And Acura's system will do this whether you're braking or not. So if you're power on or power off, the super handling all-wheel drive system is always trying to make sure that the front end is going in the direction that you're pointing the steering wheel. You'll notice that when we're out on the track, and I'm not seesawing the steering wheel like you do see if you're driving other vehicles out there, trying to maintain a perfect line out on the road. In the NSX, you basically just point it and it goes there. I'd actually say that the steering feel is a little bit similar to what we see in the Infiniti Q50 perhaps, because Infiniti is trying to do something very similar, trying to cancel out road imperfections and steering direction, trying to make that Q50 go exactly where you point it, except that Infiniti is actually turning the front wheels for you, and Acura isn't. The front wheels in the Acura are going exactly where you point them with the steering wheel. It's a complete mechanical steering column, but they're helping the car trace the line that you're intending by using that super handling all-wheel drive system. It makes this car very, very easy to drive out on a track. While some purists may initially dislike the way the steering feels, on the flip side of things, you get a very strong rear power bias because remember, 500 horsepower to the rear axle, just 72 maximum to the front axle. That means that you definitely can get the rear end of the NSX kicking out on you like you would see in a traditional rear-wheel drive vehicle, except that Acura then attempts to control that with that front axle control, and they do that very well. The combination of everything going on in the NSX really belies the weight of this vehicle. Again, the NSX weighs about 3,800 pounds, so it is about 200 pounds heavier than a comparable Porsche 911. However, the NSX hides its weight incredibly well thanks to the all-wheel drive system and the way that it is dealing with that yaw control on the front axle. The lack of the mechanical all-wheel drive system is part of the reason that we see those very wide tires in the rear of the NSX. Again, they are 305 width tires, and we also see a limited slip differential in the back to help manage that power in the rear. Hold on to your hats, folks, because it is now time to talk pricing. And depending on how you look at it, you could see the NSX as either a screaming deal or fantastically expensive. At $156,000, this is about $100,000 more expensive than the starting price on the next most expensive Acura. However, at $156,000, this is also about $700,000 less expensive than a Porsche 918 Spyder. In fact, you could buy 5 of these and an Acura MDX for the price of that one Porsche. Must-have options for me would be the $9,900 carbon ceramic brake package. It's relatively inexpensive for a carbon ceramic brake for some reason. The power seat option is $1,500. I would definitely get that. The Alcantara headliner classes up the interior. It's only $1,300. If you're already paying $160,000 for a car, you might as well check that box as well. If you want the parking sensors, the ELS sound system, and the XM satellite radio along with navigation, that's $3,300. However, that does add extra weight to the vehicle. It adds about 30 pounds to the car, so if you're really concerned about lightweight vehicles, then you may not want to check that option. Of course, if you're really concerned about the curb weight of the vehicle, the NSX might not be the right car for you anyway because it is about 3,800 pounds. Comparisons with the NSX are actually a little bit on the difficult side because this isn't really like any of the other options in this segment. I suppose the closest thematically to this would be the BMW i8, but it actually is quite a different vehicle once you scratch the surface. The i8 is relatively quick, it's relatively light, but it's a plug-in hybrid, and it actually defaults to a front-wheel drive EV mode when you leave your garage. The i8 also doesn't handle terribly well in this segment. This will definitely eat the i8 alive out on a track. The i8 is going after a different mission. It's trying to be a sexy supercar that is very green and efficient. This hybrid system just happens to be in the vehicle because of performance. Acura could have used something different in order to give you the same kind of performance. They simply chose the hybrid system. So the goal of this system was not necessarily to improve fuel economy, and the system in the i8 was definitely there to improve economy. The i8 is a little bit less expensive at $140,900, but you get a little bit less inside in terms of overall feature content. Remember that $140,000 i8 also doesn't come with navigation or satellite radio standard. That seems to be pretty normal in this ultra luxury and ultra performance segment. From that point on, the most direct competitors to the NSX really would be something like an Audi R8 V10 or a Porsche 911, probably somewhere between the 4S and the turbo model. The 911 4S would set you back $110,300, but once you start adding options to the Porsche, it does get quite expensive. You can easily end up at the $156,000 price point that we're taking a look at right here. The turbo model will be slightly faster than the NSX, and the 4S will be slightly slower than the NSX. But the turbo model will set you back more. It'll be $159,200. It actually is not quite as comfortable as the NSX either. Audi's R8 is quite comfortable, but it's also quite expensive. It's $162,900 for the R8 that's slower than the NSX. You can add about 40 grand if you want to get your R8 faster than the NSX. The way that Acura has programmed the super handling all-wheel drive hybrid system in this vehicle is really an asset both out on the road and on the track. This definitely carves corners a little bit tighter than you see in the competition. When you're turning the wheel in this, it feels like everything is going with you, just sort of like a video game. We don't see that same kind of feel in the rest of the competition. Now, some people may say that feels a little bit unnatural, but I actually like the way that it felt in the NSX. Now, I'm not quite sure whether easy to drive is an asset or a liability in this supercar category, but that definitely applies to every manner of the NSX. This is a vehicle that's very easy to live with, it's easy to drive, the suspension is daily driver suitable out on rough highways like we've been driving on here in Southern California. It even is relatively easy to park in parking lots like this. The front end is not as low as we see in some of the competition, although we have scraped it on a few bumps out here. There are a few last considerations before we go. First off, reliability. The NSX is likely going to be one of the more reliable supercars out there. To be honest, most supercars spend an awful lot of time in the dealer's garage, not your garage. And the NSX is unlikely to be that way, not just because Honda builds it, of course, but because of the design of all the systems going on here. Even though this particular hybrid system is unique to the NSX, some of the core components are actually very, very similar to other current production vehicles. The motors inside the front transmission unit and inside the back transmission unit are actually very similar to what we see in the Acura RLX and the upcoming MDX hybrid. The last thing is how you buy an NSX. Approximately 95% of Acura dealers in the United States are allowed to sell the NSX. They have to meet certain standards and certain procedures have to be followed in order to offer it. So some Acura dealers may not be able to sell one. The other thing you should keep in mind is that all NSX models are made to order in Ohio. That means that your Acura dealer may not actually have an NSX on the dealer lot for you to drive in advance. If they don't have one, you should shop around and find a dealer that does have one that you can get your hands on one before placing the order. The last thing, of course, is that you do have to order the NSX. It can take a while to get one. We do expect the first year's NSXs to sell out very, very soon, so if you do want one of these 2017 models, you'd better act fast. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. Again, I'm Alex Dykes, and this has been the 2017 Acura NSX. If you have $160,000 burning a hole in your pocket and you're not interested in about 3 or 4 Acura MDXs, go ahead and take a look at the Acura NSX. This is definitely a solid alternative to the Porsche 911. It's also going to be more unique because they're only going to be building about 800 of these a year. It actually is made right here in the United States as well. It's manufactured in Ohio. So if you're looking for perhaps a domestic supercar, oddly enough, the NSX should be on your shopping list. Be sure and check out those related videos down there at the bottom of your screen, and I'll see you next week.